evening, and welcome to this evening's edition of Scotland at 7. My name is Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Dr. Siobhan Tolland, SNP Councillor for Lochee Ward in Dundee. Hello this evening, Siobhan. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. Hiya, nice to see you.
Well, we've got an action-packed evening ahead of us, but before we come to Siobhan, we'll just go through some of the headlines and then we'll come to the stories of the day. So the Ukraine update, day 688. The US has imposed sanctions on 3 Russian entities and 1 individual involved in the transfer and testing of North Korea's ballistic missiles for Russia's use against Ukraine. North Korea's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia supports Russia's war of aggression, increases the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and undermines a global non-proliferation regime, said Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. The update on... Oops, I'm fiddling around with my papers here, all stuck together for some reason. The Israel-Gaza latest, more than 151 Palestinians have been killed and 248 injured in Gaza in the previous 24 hours, the Gaza Health Ministry has said. It brings the total number of Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes since the 7th of October to at least 23,708, according to the latest figures by the ministry. More than 60,005 people have been wounded, it said. Today is the second day of the International Criminal Justice genocide hearing, a day after South Africa argued that Israel had committed genocidal acts in Gaza with intent from the highest levels of state. The Israeli government said on Saturday that it was a partial and deeply flawed picture. Israel accused South Africa of presenting a profoundly distorted view of hostilities, very distinguishable from that of Hamas, as it presented its defence at the International Court of Justice in The Hague against accusations of genocide. The US and the UK have launched air and missile strikes in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, aimed at halting attacks on ships in the Red Sea, Washington and London announced overnight. The Post Office's leadership has been accused of showing contempt for victims after its lawyers informed the inquiry into one of the UK's worst scandals that it was not reasonable to expect them to leave no stone unturned in getting to the truth. The inquiry into the false convictions of 900 post office operators was further told it was unrealistic for the organisation's lawyers responsible for handing over internal documents to continue to work during the evenings and over weekends. The SNP have launched their 2024 UK general election campaign. Speaking at the launch of the SNP's 2024 UK general election campaign, Humza Yousaf said that the need for independence has never been more urgent. Addressing party colleagues in Glasgow, Scotland's First Minister said that voting for the SNP was essential to protect Scotland's values in the face of unforgivable Westminster damage to Scotland. Well, I'll just read through the full update of the Russia's war in Ukraine before we come to Siobhan. We'll go through the issues of the day. On Thursday, Boris Nadezhdin, a Russian presidential hopeful who opposes the war against Ukraine, met a group of soldiers' wives who are demanding that their husbands be discharged from the front line. The Kremlin critic is collecting signatures to qualify to challenge President Putin in the 15th to 17th of March vote. The EU industrial chief, Thierry Breton, is targeting €3 billion in a new scheme to ramp up production of defence equipment. We just have to make sure we are preparing for all eventualities. Russia is one of our biggest concerns, he said, arguing Europe's ammunition supplies had to be on a par with Russia. The European Commission has already allocated €1.5 billion, but wants to double the amount, said Breton, who earlier this week broached the idea of a €100 billion European Defence Fund. As Volodymyr Zelensky wrapped up his tour of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, the Ukrainian president said his country was grateful for already delivered Patriot air defence systems, without which it would be impossible to survive some attacks, but asked for some more deliveries. Latvia's President Edgars Rinkēvičs announced a new aid package, saying Riga will deliver artillery shells, anti-aircraft weapons, grenades and drones for Ukraine this year. Switzerland and Ukraine will host peace formula talks in Davos on Sunday. It is the latest in a series of meetings to rally support for Ukraine's peace plan. Ukraine's parliament have refused to debate a bill aimed at drafting more soldiers. Speaking after a closed-door meeting with Ukraine's military leaders, David Arakemia, ruling party leader, said some provisions directly violate human rights. Top defence officials from Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania signed a memorandum of understanding in Istanbul, establishing the Mine Countermeasure Naval Group in the Black Sea, which will oversee demining operations in the Black Sea to ensure safe waters after Russia's war is over. Russia's Belgorod region bordering is going through hard times due to recent shelling by Ukraine, said its governor Vyacheslav Gladkov. The Kremlin has accused the US of trying to pressure European countries into backing the seizure of frozen Russian assets overseas to help finance the rebuilding of Ukraine, an idea that has gained momentum. Ukraine's National Union of Journalists said Russian missile strikes on a hotel in Kharkiv amounted to the intimidation of media workers in order to limit the coverage of the war. 13 people were injured, including foreign journalists. Well, I mean, Siobhan, I know that we haven't sort of talked too much about Ukraine of late. We sort of, on Broadcasting Scotland, have been very loyally and quite rightly, sort of discussing, bringing headlines of the news. But Ukraine has kind of fallen off the news agenda a bit, and that may well have been part of Putin's intention when he is purported to have supported Hamas and sort of in their October the 7th attacks on Israel. I mean, there's been a lot happening with Ukraine and talks with our Baltic neighbours. How important do you think it is, especially as we look towards the Russian elections and the presidential elections in the US, with Donald Trump saying he would pull out of NATO and stop funding for Ukraine and for NATO, and doesn't care if Europe gets attacked by Russia? I mean, how much do you think the news in Ukraine should be back in the forefront of our minds?
I think that there's an issue of international destabilization at the moment, isn't there? And that's not just the kind of Russia invasion of Ukraine. It's also the Israel atrocities in Gaza as well. And we have these kind of examples now of just outright aggression that we're somehow internationally completely helpless to stop. In terms of the Donald Trump election and in terms of the Russian election, well, the last time Donald Trump got in, and the thing I kept thinking about is there's only one thing worse than two kind of, how shall I put it, two angry men, dictatorial men, locking horns, and that's when they come together. It concerns me deeply that Donald Trump getting into power will completely change the international scene, and Ukraine will be one of the victims of that, and I think Palestine will be another victim as well if it's not already. So there is massive international kind of issues at stake, and Ukraine seems to be kind of sitting at the centre of that, unfortunately. And we are losing, I don't want to say interest, because I think on an individual level people are still concerned, but on a national level, I think we've become much more insular in our thinking, and we don't seem to want to think about these issues anymore. Rishi Sunak is ready to go when tankers are being attacked, but doesn't seem to be ready to go when people are being murdered on a daily basis. So we have a real problem, I think, internationally, and we'll get to Gaza in a minute as well. And I think that Ukraine, for me, seemed to be almost a testing case to how far countries can go and how far or how little the international communities would react to that. So it's vital that we actually get a peace solution there, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. And actually, if we look at the elections this year, there's so many elections happening across the globe that the situation could become worse. So we have a real kind of responsibility internationally to try and navigate that as peacefully as we can.
Yes, I mean Vladimir Zelensky often says that if Ukraine falls, it will be the beginning of a domino effect, and we may well see a new version of the sort of oppression and hostile takeover of nations that are
Yes.
members of the EU, who that were former um, well, territories is a kind way of putting it, because they were, of course, they had no choice in the matter when Russia sort of marched into their borders. I mean, and speaking, as you say, of nations that are not respecting the borders or rights of others. I mean, more than 151 Palestinians have been killed and 248 injured in Gaza in the previous 24 hours. Um, More than 60,500 have been wounded since the 7th of October, and at least 23,708 have been killed. I mean, and speaking about Ukraine there with the bombing of a hotel with journalists, I mean, it's over 100 journalists have been
Yeah.
killed in Israel, by the Israelis, um, and seem to be actively targeted, very specifically targeted, which of course in itself is a war crime. I mean, in terms of the way in which governments listen to their people, when you see the protests happening around the world, the sea of keffiyehs being worn. I mean, I can't even go, I go to my local shop. I was climbing the hills yesterday. I was wearing a keffiyeh, which I used to wear all the time, sort of up until the Oslo Accord. And then I thought, well, perhaps peace might break out, and sort of it felt less relevant to wear. And I'm wearing my red keffiyeh, and there's a woman coming down the hill in the middle of the Angus Hills, and she's got her keffiyeh on. And people across the world really care, and yet governments are silent, apart from this incredible effort being carried out by South Africa. I mean, what do you make of that disconnect between governments and what the people of the world can clearly see, which is that the Palestinians are recording their own slaughter in plain sight?
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because actually, if you look, I had a kind of a coffee with my friend just before Christmas, and I was kind of coming at it from a very pessimistic perspective, precisely because of what you've said, Ruth. That internationally the governments are being silent. They're not doing anywhere near enough, and you've got US and UK not even demanding a ceasefire, not even anywhere near demanding a ceasefire. But his take on it was that, well, actually, no, the people are kind of standing up and being counted in this. And if you look at, I was at the rally last week in Dundee. There was a kind of, a relatively big turnout, and there's kind of the mosque is doing prayers for peace tomorrow. There's a rally in Dundee every single week. And they've vowed to kind of go there until this massacre ends. So the people are very, I think, very focused. And what I'm seeing as well is that young kids, my son and all his friends, it's very clear to them on a moral sense. It's very clear what is going on here, and they've been doing kind of events in support for Palestinian. My son was kind of trying to do the rights of the child within his school and so forth. So there really is that. It's up to us, I think, and this is what becomes kind of, this is what depresses me, I suppose, and is that the kids seem to be more adult than the adults these days, certainly those in power. But perhaps it's up to us. It's up to us to push our governments, to push as far as we can in order to kind of get some kind of resolution here and demand that Israel stops, demand that there is a ceasefire. South Africa and the other countries that are supporting South Africa are the outliers here, aren't they? And thank God they are at least trying to do something, because there is a real helplessness because our governments are not doing this. But I suppose one final point, and I was having this conversation with my son, and it reminded me back during the Iraq War when we had those massive demonstrations. Ruth, you'll remember those as well. There were huge demonstrations across the UK, and we knew that Tony Blair would not change his mind regarding that Iraq War. But sometimes it's just more important to try and do something rather than just sit back and accept fate. So we have to keep at it. I was invited to speak at the rally tomorrow, and I'm still not sure if I will, not because I don't want to, but because what do I say? What can we say? We're all feeling so bloody helpless regarding this situation. This is a genocide, I think, like no other. If you look at the Oxfam, I don't know if you've looked at the Oxfam figures just from, I think it was yesterday, saying that this is the biggest daily murder rate in the 21st century. It's more than Syria, it's more than Sudan, it's much more than Iraq. 96.5 daily death rate in Syria, and we had 250 on average. In Gaza alone, it's 150 is relatively low in comparison to this. So the death rate is utterly abominable, and we're sitting here feeling very, very helpless, and it's an appalling thing to see. I don't know what the ICG is going to rule. I hope to God that they rule it is a genocide, because we cross a moral Rubicon, I think, if they rule any other way. Because if that's not a genocide, then what on earth is a genocide? I know there's no teeth in the ICG ruling, but perhaps it'll give us some impetus to actually begin to start and demand that there must be some kind of change here. Donald Trump getting in scares me in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of stories that we'll be discussing. So it's you've touched on a few of the areas. I'll go to the ICJ, and we'll come back to what's happening in Yemen in a minute. But I mean, so a day after South Africa argued that it had committed genocidal acts in Gaza with intent from the highest levels of state, Israel said on Friday, that was a partial and deeply flawed picture. Israel claims that blame for many Palestinian civilian deaths, more than 23,000 people, about 1% of Gaza's population, have been killed since the 7th of October, and the destruction of tens of thousands of buildings cited by South Africa in support of his application lay with Hamas either directly or indirectly. Lawyers for Israel said civilians had been killed by Hamas booby-trapping homes, mining alleyways and misfiring rockets, and that the militant group's use of schools and hospitals for military purposes had caused their structures to collapse. The damage to hospitals has been widely criticised by humanitarian organisations. At the conclusion of Friday's hearing today, the president of the court, Judge Joan Donoghue, said the panel of 17 judges would aim to give their decision on whether provisional measures should be granted as soon as possible. South African lawyers asked the court on Thursday to order an immediate halt to Israeli military operations in Gaza. A decision on that request will probably take weeks, and the full case is likely to last years. Israel said all of the provisional measures requested by South Africa should be rejected, warning that if ordered, they would advantage Hamas at Israel's expense. Having listened to Israel's arguments on Thursday, South Africa's Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, who opened the case against Israel at the ICJ, said he remained confident in South Africa's compelling case. He said that contrary to the suggestion by Israel, South Africa had condemned Hamas and called for the military group to release the hostages and be investigated. He also said no matter what some individuals within the group of Palestine and Gaza may have done, and no matter how great the threat to Israel's citizens might be, genocidal attacks on the whole of Gaza with the intent of destroying them cannot be justified. The 1948 Genocide Convention, enacted in the wake of the mass murder of Jews in the Nazi Holocaust, defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. The ICJ's decisions are final and without appeal, but the court has no way to enforce them. I mean, this is... I saw some very powerful footage or comments, an article by a Northern Irish writer saying that that he was a baby at the time where there was a schoolgirl walking to school and she was shot in the back by British forces in Northern Ireland. And it was only as an adult that he learned that not only had his dad been at the scene and had tried to help the girl despite being threatened by the British forces, that he himself had been in the car as a baby. He was there. And he said that this, watching Ireland's participating in Ireland's lawyers participating in this court action by South Africa, which of course has its own very painful experience of this kind of apartheid and random slaughter. That actually the people of Ireland understood what it was to just be walking to school and be shot randomly. And anybody who saw the footage of, that little boy with his granny and she's got her white flag and she's shot in front of the child and he's disappeared, or that little boy yesterday picking up body parts and mangled flesh from his relatives and putting them in a plastic bag to take home. I mean, it's very hard it's very hard to sit and watch that and to know that the slaughter is happening, and to watch David Cameron talking about, he doesn't know if it's okay for Israel to turn water off. It's kind of like, I mean, are we not at that point where, what we're doing now is what we would have been doing in the 1930s? I mean, surely Gary Lineker was right at that, at least.
Yeah. I mean, just a point to pick up, there's no kids walking to school in Gaza anymore because the schools have all been bombed. 70% of school buildings have been damaged and the rest of them are being used as shelters. They're the only schooling left is impromptu ones in the refugee camps. So, the schooling infrastructure has been completely and utterly decimated. But yeah, we are witnessing, and the phrase I keep coming up with is we are literally crossing this Rubicon here, because we're reaching a point where the morality of things seems to have disappeared. We're being told, I mean, in the early days of this attack on Gaza, there was even pressure on us not being able to say things like genocide and so forth, when it so clearly is. We have this real kind of problem that we are witnessing mass murder, mass slaughter. 2.2 million people, according to the aid agencies, are at risk of imminent risk of famine. That's the population, because 10% of food is only allowed in, aid's not allowed in. There are nowhere for these people to go. This is a horrendous thing to watch. My friend, who's a mental health nurse, said that it feels a wee bit like we're being vicariously traumatized by watching it. Now, what are these people experiencing? They're being pushed from place to place, told to go X place, which is safe, and then that becomes bombed. This is not an attack on Hamas. This is, as Hamza says, our First Minister, collective punishment against the Palestinian people. And the problem with the Israeli cabinet, of course, is that they do not distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinian people. We've also got senior members in the Israeli cabinet that are part of the white settler movement, that are looking and have been openly talking about moving back in to the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu said just the other day that the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli army, would be part of Gaza for as long as they foresee. No matter what happens in the future in Gaza, the Israeli Defense Force will be there. So we're talking about a takeover of that land by the looks of things, and we're talking about a mass imminent starvation of the people in Gaza, and there is no way for them to escape. In most other wars, there are borders where people can escape to and escape from the horrors. This is extraordinarily difficult in Gaza because Israel run those borders. So we're passing a point, I think, that if we allow this, then anything becomes possible in terms of murder and genocide and international relations. And that scares me. That scares me completely.
Well, I think you're probably right to be scared. It's a terrifying prospect to see that we've come so far. The lessons we thought we'd learned about the various slaughters that have happened around the world, from the Holocaust in Germany and Poland to Rwanda and just. But I mean, the UN humanitarian office has said the Israeli authorities are systematically denying it access to northern Gaza to deliver aid, and this has significantly hindered the humanitarian operation there. In separate comments, the UN Human Rights Office has said Israel has repeatedly failed to uphold international humanitarian law. I mean, Jordan has said Israeli war crimes against Palestinians are to blame for heightened regional tension and violence in the Red Sea, which it says threatens to ignite a wider war in the Middle East. Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi said today that the international community had failed to act to stop Israeli aggression against Palestinians, which is endangering the region's security. And, you've got the US and UK launching air and missile strikes in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen aimed at halting attacks on ships in the Red Sea. I mean, the President Biden said American and UK forces with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands were involved in the attack, striking at least 60 targets in 16 locations around Yemen. President Biden said these strikes are in direct response to unprecedented Houthi attacks against international maritime vessels in the Red Sea, including the use of anti-ship ballistic missiles for the first time in history. These attacks have endangered US personnel, civilian mariners, and our partners, jeopardized trade, and threatened freedom of navigation. US Central Command said the airstrikes, which took place around 3 a.m. in Yemen, targeted radar systems, air defense systems, and storage and launch sites for one-way attack, unmanned aerial systems, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. Targets, including the capital city Sana'a, were hit by fighter jets from the US Navy, US Air Force, and Royal Air Force from the UK, along with ship-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles. Other locations reported targeted by Houthi officials were in the area of the port city of Hadida and the cities of Sada and Dakhmar. Rishi Sunak confirmed UK participation in the strike, saying, "We have taken limited, necessary and proportionate action in self-defence alongside the United States against targets tied to these attacks to degrade Houthi military capabilities and protect global shipping." Westminster Parliament was not asked to approve the military action in advance because it was taken in self-defence, but the Cabinet and Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, were consulted last night in advance of the bombing. Speaking in Glasgow today, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP and the Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf both said the Westminster Parliament should have been over the UK military, should have been recalled over the UK military involvement in the attacks. Oil prices have hit $80 a barrel today as fears grew about the economic impact of disruption to international trade through the Red Sea and escalating tensions in the Middle East, raising concerns about a possible inflation shock for the world economy. Brent crude prices jumped by about 4% to a high of $80.75 a barrel, while US West Texas intermediate crude also increased after the US and UK airstrikes in Yemen. I mean, here we see the gritty and grisly side of it all, isn't it? I mean, it all comes down to they'll go to war over ships and trade, but nobody gives two hoots about thousands of children being slaughtered, or World Health Organization or Médecins Sans Frontières doctors being killed. It's sort of like the grisly face of capitalism writ large. And I mean, I always found it very interesting that you know the sort of some of the nations across the sort of the Gulf area and the Horn of Africa that were being asked to allow sort of US and UK troops to be stationed there were saying no, and that shipping was having to take longer routes. I mean, this whole issue of sovereignty. Brexit was imposed upon Scotland because a few sort of Brexity type MPs were all about the sovereignty of UK waters, and yet people who are saying that that we can't use their waters for our ships to pass through now get bombed. I mean, how would the Brexiters feel if France were to take such a view? I mean, I know that's not perhaps a direct parallel, nor perhaps realistic, but I mean, it's just sort of to put the point. I mean, is this post-colonialism? Is this a sort of the UK and Western US colonialist mindset just being exposed all over again?
I mean, it's, I mean, one of the first post-Brexit trade deals that the UK was negotiating was with Australia, wasn't it? And it was warships, the building of warships. So you've kind of got that. I mean, the UK and the US have historically invested very heavily in arms, but it seemed to me that the post-Brexit reality is actually becoming even more armed, if that makes sense. And I take your point actually about the kind of like almost extreme capitalism. We've moved into this arena. where where multinational companies have been fighting for the same status as a human being. You'll remember that legal case from a few years ago in the US, but things are more important than people. And actually, it's almost that end of capitalism extremism where people have no value beyond their economic value, beyond the things that they can produce and they can buy and they can make. And I think that to me, I was when I was watching the Rishi Sunak and the whole kind of attacks. This is what kept crossing my mind. It's like how quick to act were the UK and the US for the protection of trade, for the protection of things, for the protection, as you say, of our sovereignty. But not one single word, not one single word of criticism when we have 10,000 kids that have been murdered by the Israeli army in a terrible, terrible genocide that is happening by the Israeli government. So we really are at odds, and it's coming back to this. Things seem to be kind of coming to a head in the Middle East here, and it's quite quite a scary situation. On a local level, I think that Stephen Flynn and Hamza Yusuf were absolutely correct. This notion of we're allowed to do what we want because it's self-defense, well, that is the Israel government's justification of what's happening in Gaza as well. This notion that we can just use that language, self-defense, and then do what we want is extremely worrying. And that's why international law was brought in the first place, isn't it? Because
it's very odd though, isn't it? I mean, that the thing about the argument of self-defense, because the UK ships don't have to be there. It's not as though the Houthi rebels. I mean, and I'm not justifying in any way, obviously, the shooting of ships and any human life that is being impacted by that. Obviously, that I'm not justifying that. But if you're looking at it from a semantic point of view, the Houthi rebels aren't coming to bomb Dover, so this is very much sort of seems to me to be within this kind of expansionist sort of post-colonial framework that I want to be able to pass through your territory. And I'm not sure that kind of jingoism would wash if somebody was, sort of trying to do the same off Dover, for example. But I mean, we're looking again at, as people were quite rightly pointing out today. I mean, like Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of Westminster, was called in at 3 a.m. and told that they were going to go to war, and he offered to recall Parliament immediately for it to be debated, and was told there was no need because basically the bombs were already dropping on one of the world's poorest countries. And somebody else pointed out that there's no magic money tree to feed children or to make sure there's enough ambulances or to make sure that councils across England aren't going bankrupt, but suddenly there's enough money to bomb one of the poorest countries in the world.
There's always money for war. They always find money for war. They always do. There's never been a problem. Whereas no government, UK government, has ever said, "Oh, we can't do that because we don't have the funds." They only do it for things like social security, and that's where the contradictions completely open up. And I think that as the general election begins to we saw the launch today, and we're all beginning to kind of swing into action, working on the assumption that it might be May because Rishi Sunak said it was going to be October. But these are issues that we really should be discussing here in Scotland. What would our role in an international level be? What kind of role does Scotland want to play in the international community? Do we want to do what the UK has just done? Do we want to do what the US has just done? And these are questions I think we need to get answers from the Labour Party as well in Scotland and within the UK. What is their position on the international level here? Because I don't see much resistance there. So we need to start.
Of course, I mean,
what international community we want.
Keir Starmer today was saying, of course, that, basically, whatever she does, that's cool by me. He doesn't seem to have a different, that seems to be his default position. But I mean, is this not the kind of thing? I mean, I know that I've been at discussions where I've heard you talking, for example, and others about what an independent Scotland would look like, what our armed forces would look like. And it seems to be very much the kind of conversation that an independent Scotland's people need to be looking at and talking about. And, that there's very much this sense that the armed forces in an independent Scotland would be based on defence rather
Yeah.
than being an expeditionary force. So very much the sort of the Irish model. I mean, is this not the kind of thing that is very topical and that perhaps we should be hearing more about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that personally, I think the SNP should the SNP should be leading a general election campaign on such international issues, as well as domestic issues like cost of living crisis, of course, as well. But we have international tensions that are extraordinarily high at the moment. We're witnessing a massive, unprecedented period of aggression. So we have to start thinking about it. And these are the questions that we have to put to the people of Scotland now. I think that these are genuine questions, and let's see what the people of Scotland actually want. If they want a UK kind of, bulldog aggressive, international positioning, then okay, that's okay. But we can offer an alternative, and I don't think the people of Scotland. I think the people of Scotland will vote for a more defensive, more internationalist, and more peaceful outlook in terms of how we will connect with the international community. But these are questions that are vital now at this moment in time. I think Scotland, just one final point, but I think what's happened since the kind of attack on Gaza has been that our First Minister has been incredibly peaceful in his thinking and incredibly conciliatory and calling out aggression where it is. And I think there is a role that Scotland can play within the international stage. I think that the voice that we can offer will be huge, and it will be a plan for peace. One thing that broke my heart is when the UN voted for a ceasefire and the UK abstained. And I just thought, oh God, Scotland could have been a voice for a ceasefire in that. And it's that kind of thing that we need to think about in terms of an independent Scotland. What role will we play internationally?
I mean, it was very interesting when we were speaking at the launch of the SNP's 2024 UK general election campaign. Humza Yousaf said that the need for independence has never been more urgent, and that page one, line one of the SNP election manifesto will say this: vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. He pointed to the devastating impact of Westminster's cost of living crisis on Scottish households, saying that only through independence can Scotland escape the UK Brexit-based economy that has overseen stagnated wages, staggeringly high levels of inequality, and low investment. He said that independence is, because core belief that decisions about Scotland should be taken in Scotland because Westminster doesn't work for Scotland. I mean, the First Minister, Mr Humza Yousaf, said that it was only with independence that an elected Scottish government would have the full range of powers needed to build the kind of country he believes is possible. And looking at the cost of living crisis, he said that the need for independence has never been more urgent because the UK economy has failed far too many people in Scotland, pointing to wages stagnating, high inequality, low investment, and the fact that both Labour and the Conservatives are committed to a Brexit-based economy no matter the cost to Scotland. In terms of the economy, Mr Yousaf said, on this most important of concerns, the economy and living standards, both Labour and the Conservatives are offering more of the same. Economic decline is still decline, even if it is managed slightly more competently. And Mr Yousaf insisted it does not have to be that way for Scotland. Turning to Scotland's advantages, the First Minister listed Scotland's massive renewable energy resources, world-leading universities, brilliant industries such as food and drink, advanced manufacturing, tourism, and a wonderful creative sectors. When we look at independent countries in Europe that are like Scotland, what do we see, he asked? Countries that are fairer than the UK, wealthier than the UK, and more productive than the UK. So with all our advantages and talents, why not Scotland? Well, I mean, I'm sure that is something many of our listeners and viewers will be shouting to the top of their hearts, Siobhan, why not Scotland? And with all of that, and with all the warm words that were said, I still kind of didn't really get the sense that, I know that the First Minister has said that a vote for Scotland, a vote for the SNP, is a vote for Scotland to become independent. But there
Mhm.
was an awful lot of chat about what they were going to do in Westminster too. I mean, how clear do you think the messaging is? Because there's a lot of people now looking and thinking, well, if we want change, the SNP doesn't represent change. SNP represents more of the same. Maybe Labour represents change. Why do you think, as an SNP councillor, obviously, that Labour are not the answer, and that we should march up the hill one more time with the SNP?
I mean, I think that, from a common sense voter perspective, I can see the attraction of voting Labour. And actually, this is the dilemma that the SNP does actually have, because we've spent a lot of time talking about kicking the Tories out. But what we have is an immediate solution that might actually just do that. And that looks like that it could be the Labour Party. However, in Scotland, the choices are actually quite different, aren't they? And what we've got to, I think what the SNP need to do is straddle that line between the immediacy of what Labour can offer, which is literally Tories out, and that's what Scotland wants. Tories out, but offer, and I think Humza said that today, the First Minister said that today, which was basically, it's not a case of getting rid of the Tories temporarily. We can get rid of the Tories completely. So we have a tension, I think, that the SNP does have to resolve. I think that the stronger we go on independence, the more we will distance ourselves from Westminster, and the more we will distance ourselves from what a Labour government may or may not offer. One of the things that I thought was particularly good about the speech today was looking at the
Mm.
things that Scotland can offer advice to the Labour Party, showing that actually we are the more progressive party, that Scotland as an independent nation can become a more progressive nation as a result of that. But the push for independence has to be front and centre of this. I understand the point, that there might be some criticism about how we can what we will be doing in Westminster, but no one is realistically thinking that we will be leaving Westminster the day after the general election. There will be negotiations that have to be done. So effectively, we will be there, and we will hopefully be negotiating our leaving, but we have to work within that while we're there. What the last thing I would say is this: the SNP victory will only be as strong as the votes that we get. So the stronger the votes we get, the bigger the vote the SNP gets, then the more power we have to push forward independence. We are only going to be as strong as the people that vote for us. And that is absolutely important to say. Now, independence is not an SNP thing. And I say that as an SNP member and councillor. It is much further beyond an SNP thing. It is much wider. It always has been, and it always will be. You can see that in the polls. Support for independence is sitting 50-50, but support for the SNP is much lower. Having said that, we're in a position where we have to do it party politically, and that's unfortunate, but that's the next democratic lever that we have. So we must, that SNP is only as strong as the people that will vote for it. Two things I think that we need. We need the SNP to promote independence at every single turn, and we need the biggest amount of people, the biggest majority that we can possibly get, in order to embolden the SNP to move forward with that.
I
So
mean,
it, it
but I mean, Siobhan, with all, we both know that it would be very hard for the SNP to win more seats than they won in 2015. I mean, 53 seats out of or 56 seats out of 59. It's
yeah,
it's you're never going to get more than that, and yet. I mean, I understand. I've
yeah,
spoken to the Minister for Independence, Jamie Hepburn, and said, okay, talk to me like I'm an idiot here, and maybe didn't quite put it that way, of course, but it's you know, tell me why it is that a vote for the SNP this time is going to be a betterer mandate than it was in 2015, or it was in all those other years has been a majority. Now, it has been explained to me that the difference this time is that it's not a mandate to ask for independence, it is a mandate to deliver independence. But we need to hear that surely
Yeah.
from the First Minister, from Stephen Flynn, and I'm not hearing that. And if I'm somebody who's had these conversations with senior SNP politicians, and I'm willing to kind of, okay, right, fine, that's what they're saying, let's deliver it, let's see it delivered. And if I'm not hearing that in any of the if I'm not hearing that in any of this rhetoric or these speeches, then what chance do the ordinary voter have, who's perhaps
Yeah.
just working working 15 hours a day just to try and keep the house warm and food on the table? How are people supposed to hear this messaging if it's not spelled out for us very, very clearly?
Well, I mean, it has been spelled out in terms of the resolution that was voted for confidence at conference, because obviously, what we were talking about is the paper that we would produce, that the SNP would produce afterwards, in terms of our extrication from the UK. That's not quite how they called it, but I absolutely get your point, and I think the messaging has to be absolutely clear, and it's certainly one of the things that I will be pushing, and am pushing at this moment in time. If we do not have our commitment to independence front and centre of the campaign, then we must. I mean, it's, for me, it is an absolute must. So the messaging must be right, and you're absolutely right. What people need to know on a common sense, everyday level, is that we will push this forward. For me, I see the kind of shift towards independence just a bit more progressive, in the sense that I see the general election as the next phase or the next stage in our shift towards independence. It's not a case of each event is a be all and end all, but what we need is the people behind us. We can only become independent if the people demand it. What we need to do as a party, in terms of the SNP, is galvanise the people into that. And I think that that's maybe where the problem that we have at the moment is that we're not quite galvanising that yet. So I
But is
think
that
there
is
needs
that
to be
not
a little
because
bit more
people
of that.
is that not because people have been so galvanized over the last two general elections, or three general elections now?
And the
Because
rest.
they thought what they were voting for was for independence. I mean, this kind of this semantic nuance of the mechanism and the semantic difference between asking for a mandate, or like a mandate to ask for it, and the difference that now Humza
With
Yousaf
all
is
due
saying is that
respect, it's
this is the
not a
mandate to
semantic.
deliver it.
It's not. It's going to. With all due
But
respect, it's
but
not a
but it
semantic. With all
but
due
it is when
respect,
people don't understand it.
not with it's not a semantic difference. There is a big difference between requesting and demanding, or requesting and taking. And it's maybe that's where we need to be very clear. Maybe that's the core where we need to be very clear, because it's not semantics. This is a shift in the balance of power between Scotland and the UK. That's where the messaging maybe needs to go, because it's not a case of, can we please have, which I think a lot of people maybe quite fairly see the history of that. What we need now is, this is what we will take, this is what we'll demand, and this is what we will do.
And I think that is the thing which I heard Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, saying at the SNP conference.
Yeah.
But but that's not but but that is, for many people, semantics. I mean, I totally take your point. You're right. It's not semantics if that is a
Mhm.
material change. But for many people, what they're hearing, if they're not paying attention, then that does seem like semantics rather than the difference. So it's that thing about how do you, as an activist, and somebody who's within that sort of seat of high discussions within the SNP,
I
how do you
ain't.
get that? No, but you know what I mean. I mean, okay, you're a very, very active councillor who has a seat at a number of tables where you hear these discussions. How do you, as an activist, get that message across to the First Minister, who calls himself the first activist? How do you get
Yeah.
that across, that actually this is a message? I thought he did an extremely good
Mhm.
job today of outlining, sort of saying that basically you've got Keir Starmer, who is the basically sort of Rishi Sunak light. You've got a sort of a chancellor in waiting who's just going to carry on with the same austerity politics. You've got Wes Streeting, the health minister in waiting, who's going to hold the door open to privatisation. I mean, he did a very good job of
Yeah.
making that very clear. But still, it comes down to this thing about how do people really get that messaging. And I thought also he did a very good job. I wasn't a big fan of Stephen Flynn talking about, get rid of the Tories forever. Now,
Mhm.
regardless of what you may or may not think of the Conservative Party, they are elected by and voted for by a significant chunk of the Scottish population, and democracy demands that there is a right of
Mhm.
centre representation. I guess the thing is that and Hamza Yusuf did say that that there would be the last unelected and
Yeah.
imposed Tory government, which I thought was an important clarification. But the whole issue of the spectrum of political parties that we will have after independence being representative of Scottish policies and the Scottish electorate,
Well,
and
well,
not the Westminster
well,
philosophy.
there's a couple of issues to kind of maybe unpick, and I'll start off with the Conservatives in Scotland. There is a place for a right of centre political party, but we are absolutely kidding ourselves if Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party is right of centre. They are an extreme right wing political party that has gone so far to the right that half the Tory party MPs have left in disgust. That is perhaps what Scotland will never vote for. We will vote, as we often do. There will always be space for a right of centre political party, and the Conservatives. But if you think, do you really think that the Conservatives in Scotland are actually of the same ilk as the Westminster ones? Maybe Douglas Ross aside, to be perfectly honest. So there is a difference here, and that I think is where the political difference between Scotland and I want to say England, but I don't want to blame England if that makes sense. It's the English political system. What we have is an extreme right wing government and a Labour Party that's following them to the right. In Scotland, the politics is different. The Conservative Party are not to that ilk, I don't think. So, yes, there's space for Conservative. There always will be. Democratic representation demands it, as you say. But the Conservatives that we're talking about in Scotland are not the same. And I can't remember the second point I was going to make. It was actually about Hamza's, it was actually about the messaging, actually, that you were talking about in terms of the independence and, the push for independence. We're working with a dual audience. We're talking about this from an activist perspective, and independence becomes absolutely massively core to that campaign. But we have another audience. We have the undecideds, we have the unsure, we have those that support independence that might be thinking of Labour. So we still have to talk through the process of why independence is important. So we need that kind of dual messaging almost. We need to think about we're activists and the messaging towards that. Independence has to be front and centre, but we still have to make the case for independence, especially for those who are mindful that independence might be useful, maybe unsure, but especially I think for those that think that independence is important, but think let's vote for the Labour Party because we'll get the Tories out anyway. So there's a lot of messaging and a lot of nuance that needs to be done. That's not to detract from the fact that independence must be front and centre, but it's how we message that to the general population that becomes important.
I mean, again, the First Minister did obviously a good job of sort of raising that point, sort
Yeah.
of saying, that if people were to vote for the Labour Party, then they were voting for a party that was going to take independence off the table, and that was like an active vote for staying within the union. I mean, when you're out and about speaking to people, how clear do you think they are um, about these issues? It's all very well sort of people who are in the bubble, sort of political animals like myself and elected officials like yourself. I mean, it's we get it, but how much do you think people who, their day to day is just a grind trying to get through the
Yeah.
day, and that
Yeah.
may also be one of the intentions behind some of the crueler political issues that are being forced on people, is to help people disengage, sort of remove democracy and just force people into a state of misery so that they're heads down just trying to survive. When you're speaking to people, whether you're out on the doors or just, people who are you come across in day-to-day life that aren't in the bubble, how much do you think any of this messaging is getting through?
In terms of independence, I'm not so sure at this stage. I think that everybody, I mean, if we think 10 years on from the referendum, everybody now knows what independence is, everybody now knows what it means, and so forth. So, in that respect, it certainly got through. I think that the cost of living crisis is the most important, I think, a topic on everybody's mind, because it's the one that holds the most difficulty, the most trauma, the most poverty-stricken experiences that we're having to date. So it's managing that, and actually showing that there can be alternative ways. I was at the Tom Nairn conference just not that long before Christmas, and I can't remember who it was. I think he was a historian, and he was talking about the polling and how, you know, it's cost of living, it's NHS, it's education, and independence is often somewhere kind of down a bit. But actually, how he described it is that independence sits almost in a different sphere, because you've got these core issues and you've got this kind of sphere that's there that people understand, but actually maybe not quite connecting it together yet. That's the job of the SNP. That's the job of the independence movement within the next year, is to make those connections. If we can't offer advice and guidance and a plan to come out of this cost of living crisis that was absolutely ultra right wing Tory led, then we will lose the battle for independence, because they have to come together. We must show an alternative. One
I
of
mean,
the
I've
things that
I've heard it said by a number of politicians, as well as, you know, people like Gordon McIntyre Kemp in the Wellbeing Economy,
yeah,
think tanks like Commonweal,
yeah,
that you know, it's not independence or austerity; it's independence to end austerity,
yes,
and it's that thing about, I mean, as Leslie
absolutely,
Riddick is always
yes,
doing, is sort of trying
yeah,
to sort of draw comparisons. But how
yeah.
successful do you think the SNP as a political entity is in joining those dots? I mean, obviously, it's not helped by the fact that the sort of the Scottish media, I mean, other than Broadcasting Scotland and the likes of Caledon Radio and Independence Live and the podcasts, and but, you know, the mainstream media seems particularly bad at having any kind of mature discussions that might help people come to conclusions that were realistic and sensible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm mindful of a study that the Guardian did back in 2014, and they did a bit of a kind of a poll, and which effectively said that the more people thought about independence, the more people were likely to kind of move across to independence. So there's a strategy, I think, a deliberate strategy to kind of keep people on their toes, and actually get people not thinking about these issues. Hence the media barrage. In terms of the SNP, well, I think electorally we've always surprised ourselves, not just in terms of the SNP, in terms of the support for independence and actually support for Europe as well. If we look at 2015 aside, if we look at every single election, we've always surprised ourselves at how well we have done. Not just the SNP, pro Europe parties, for instance, did really well after Brexit. So there is always that kind of sense that I think on the ground, people have a common sense understanding that independence is probably the best way forward. I think the last general election in 2019 was a test of Scottish opinion. And what Scotland decided was that they were willing to give up the UK for Europe. If we look at the results back then, it was the pro-European parties that did well, and the European elections did exactly the same as well. So there was a kind of a bit of a decision making there that Scotland made. What we've got now is we've got to decide what's the path that's next. In terms of how successful we are, well, the general election is the test of how successful the messaging will be. I'm confident that people will, in Scotland, on a common sense basis, vote for an independent supporting party, and SNP being certainly the main one. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a hard ride, and it's incumbent on the SNP to get that messaging correct.
Well, that's a very good way to end the programme this evening. And obviously, conversations like we've had this evening really just highlight why Broadcasting Scotland is such an important asset to Scotland and to viewers in Scotland, because you're going to hear the conversations here that you really aren't getting anywhere else. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up and makes regular monthly payments, thank you very much. But we now urgently need to raise at least £10,000 to pay our bills within the next 7 days. We have raised just over £3,000 thanks to the generosity of our supporters. However, we need to raise remaining 7,000 by Monday. So if you can help us pay the bills, that would be awful good. We need to be able to keep making these programs. This is a really important year coming up. So please donate whatever you can afford. My thanks goes this evening to Siobhan Tolland. I'm Ruth Watson. Thank you for watching.